Well, Victor, it's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about your book, The Impossible State, North Korea, Past and Future. And I found that it was a very interestingly structured book because it has part memoir, part history, and part, I guess, what I would call international relations theorist's sketchbook on North Korea. What were you hoping to accomplish by writing this book, and what kind of impact do you hope it'll have?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you didn't say punditry as one of the other topics. Well, I mean, Scott, the reason that I wanted to write this book, when I left the government in 2007, I really had no desire to write a book about North Korea. I've been dealing with the issue for 3 years, involved in negotiations, seeing everything, really close up, and I just didn't have a desire to write it then. But 5 years later, and given the situation that North Korea was in, it seemed like a good opportunity to write a little bit about my experiences there, a bit about the history and about the U.S. policy, really to a more general audience, because I think this is a sort of issue where the educated reader doesn't really know a lot about North Korea, its history. I mean, they see headlines about missile tests, about irrational leaders, and all these sorts of things. And I just thought it would be good to write a book that people could look to as sort of a comprehensive assessment of, the history, the family, the economics, the politics, the human rights situation, the nuclear problem, that they could look to every time they had a question about what was going on with North Korea. So it's not a, I wouldn't call it a scholarly book, though it does have footnotes. It is really written to a more general audience that might be interested in trying to learn something about this country on the far side of the planet.
Yeah. The book also has a point of view, and it, I think, is informed by your experience in the Bush administration. How did you decide to kind of infuse it with that kind of point of view, a set of arguments really about North Korea's future that, it's a little bit different from a straight history, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I think any history has an opinion in it. And I think in this case, particularly the parts about U.S. policy, I mean, certainly they were informed by my own experiences dealing with the North Koreans in the Bush administration. But I thought I also tried to give it an objective assessment in terms of the overall view that every U.S. administration, going back to Ronald Reagan, has tried to deal with this problem. Ronald Reagan had his own engagement initiative, George H.W. Bush did, Bill Clinton did, George W. Bush and Barack Obama all did. And so while I think there are some of my own personal views about how I thought President Bush handled the situation, and there are probably things in there that readers might disagree with, but I think there are also things in there that readers would be surprised about in terms of what President Bush sought in terms of diplomacy with North Korea, which is not normally something that they would associate with President Bush's views on North Korea. So that was a natural thing that where I could add something on this that perhaps other authors who've written on the topic would not be able to.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily take an ideological perspective in your evaluation of the other administrations, but you do give a kind of critical review of successes and failures of other administrations in dealing with the issue. One of the, I guess the basic thesis of the book is that North Korea is the impossible state because no one inside is empowered to overthrow it, and no one on the outside cares enough to risk the costs of changing it. And I want to ask you about both of those. In particular, starting with no one is empowered to overthrow it, why do you think that that has been the case in North Korea? I mean, especially from a comparative politics perspective, this really makes North Korea an outlier compared to what we saw with the former Soviet Union.
Right. I think that observation is quite accurate, I think, when we look at the Soviet Union, when we look at the regimes in the Arab Spring, all of which have had leaders in power longer than the former, recently deceased North Korean leader, They have all collapsed, and North Korea continues to survive. So that alone is evidence that nobody within the system is empowered to overthrow it. But I think it's also just because, as you know well, I mean, the very strict controls that exist in this country. It's a society in which to use the term strong state would be an understatement. This is about the strongest state in terms of the control that it has on the society and on political freedoms and even thought, even the way people think. And so for that reason, it's very difficult to imagine that there could be a group within this society that could speak out, that could challenge views at a party congress. These sorts of things just don't happen in North Korea. So that's why it has lasted for this long, I think, because in spite of a lot of its problems, economic problems, human rights problems, food problems, it has lasted this long. And that is because no one within the system is capable of changing it.
But there are potential forces for change going on inside North Korea. I mean, you talk about marketization, information flows. We're not, it's maybe post-totalitarian, but we're obviously not to the place where there's an organized opposition. How long do you think it's going to take for us to see the evolution of politics in North Korea to a point where it's possible for dissent to be expressed?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as political scientists, we're supposed to be able to determine when these sorts of things happen, when you sort of reach a critical tipping point, but I don't think we can. I mean, I don't think we can say with any degree of accuracy what the tipping point in terms of when a society is ready to act up, and rather than simply be follow the rules of the current political system. In the case of North Korea, as you say in the book, I talk a lot about the element that I think is new in this picture, which is the growing markets in the country, really starting from the famine of the 1990s, in which people basically had to sell whatever they could find, a cup, a pen, for food, and that was the start of a market in a system that never really had markets before. And that has been going on now for 15 years. So I think what we can say is that there is this element there that was not there in the past, that has created more of an independence of mind by the people in North Korea, and not being solely reliant on handouts from the government. But when exactly that's going to reach a point where the system will tip, it's very hard to say.
Yeah, and how do you think the state is adapting to some of those changes?
Well, I mean, part of the way they're adapting is they're trying to crack down on, certainly on the unofficial markets that have existed, some of the official markets. There have been efforts at reform, what you might call reform in North Korea, some of the economic cooperation projects with the affluent South Korea. But these have largely been aimed at bringing hard currency in to help the regime, not so much to create real market reform in the country. And so I think that what we're seeing now, if we do see efforts at economic engagement with the outside world, the North Korean leadership is doing this because they seek hard currency, not because they are seeking necessarily to create a better life for their people.
Yeah. And in what ways do you think pockets of protests could emerge, or do you think that it's going to be a case where anything that happens is just going to be stamped out? Do you see any possibility for the elites, tolerating certain forms of dissent?
Yeah. Well, right now it's hard to imagine that, and the question as to whether you can, at what point we will see either toleration of dissent or the emergence of dissent. Again, as social scientists, we can't predict that. But what we can do is we can point to certain preconditions that exist that could lead to that. And so I think certainly the market mentality is certainly one of these things. But it's very hard to say. Well, at least there's not a lot of evidence that this regime is tolerant of any sort of dissent. There's not a lot of evidence that they have tried to listen to the content of whatever protests have taken place in North Korea, And of course, it goes without saying that this is a country that it's very hard